Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at Java's math class. Let's get started. We've got two learning goals for today. The first is that you can use common methods in the math class, including ABS, POW, and square root to solve problems. And the second is that you can use math.random to make a random number in any range. Java's math class gives us a whole collection of constants and methods that we can use for simple and advanced math calculations. Now, typically when we have a class, our first thing is going to be to make an object. So maybe we need to do something like math m equals new math, and then we can use the object m to do calculations. But in the math class, this isn't the case. All you have to do with the math class is call the constants and the methods straight from the class. Let's see what that looks like. So here, in the first part of my calculation, I want to access the value of pi. So I say math, as in the math class, dot pi, or math dot pow, or math dot square root, or math dot absolute value. I don't have to create an object. In fact, I can't create an object. When I use the math class, I have to call the constants and methods straight from the class. The reason for this is that everything in the math class is declared as static. Now, static is a new word for us, but in a long story short, it means that something exists without being tied to an object. So the constants and methods in the math class exist even though we're not going to make a math object. We will unpack static in a lot more detail in a future unit, but for now, let's just talk about it in some broad terms. So again, the static modifier allows us to use the variables and methods in a class without making an object. And you can see this example of what the math class might look like. There's a constant, that's what final does, right? There's a constant pi, and notice it is declared as static. Here's a method, absolute value, that takes the absolute value of a number, and it is also declared as static. And simply put, that means that I can call on this constant or method without making an object. And this is good when a class is just providing services like the math class does, because I can skip the step of creating the object. However, using static can be bad when we want to make objects that have unique data. So let me give you an example. So imagine your bank account, right? Your bank account is basically a number, and that number represents how much money you have. And you can imagine that through a bank, there are many bank account objects, right? Each person has their bank account, and maybe they have more than one bank account. Maybe they have a savings account object and a checking account object and so forth. Now, in a banking situation, your balance, the amount of money you have, would not be static. And that's a good thing because it means that each individual object will have its own unique value for the balance. That's not static. However, if your bank account balance was static, that would mean that that balance was actually shared among all the accounts in the bank. So you, your neighbor, someone across town, your bank account would all share the same amount of money. And when your neighbor took money out, you would lose money. And when you put money in, they would gain money. And so in that sense, static wouldn't be a good solution for a bank account balance, but for the math class, it is a good solution because the math class isn't maintaining any of its own data, and static allows us to use the stuff in the math class without creating an object. The math class contains a lot of constants and methods, like a lot. But for our purposes, let's just talk about a few of them. So math.abs will take the absolute value of x and return it. Math.pow raises a base to some exponent. So you could say math.pow 5, 2, and it would return 25. You can say math.square root, which takes the square root of a number x. And you can also use the math class to make a random number with math.random. And we'll unpack that one a little bit more in the last part of this lesson. Let's do a quick understanding check. So on this slide, I've got two Java commands that use the math class. So I want you to pause the video, think about what result each of them will produce, and when you're ready, resume, and we'll talk about the answer. 16 and 9 are the solutions you should have gotten. In problem number 1, we take 4 and square it, and so that results in 16. In number 2, starting with the parentheses, we do the absolute value of negative 25, which is positive 25, take the square root of that result, which is 5, and then add 4, and get a final result of 9. In general, the math class is pretty easy to use, but using it to make random numbers can be a bit tricky, and this is something you need to be good at, so we want to spend some time and unpack this. So the math.random method generates a random number in the range of 0 to 1. Notice that 0 is inclusive and 1 is not, so the number range it actually generates is 0 to 0.9999. Now, if we were to create and print such a number, we might get something like 0.422, etc. And while this is a random number, it probably isn't that useful because it's just a decimal. And so I wonder, how could we work with this and get a number in the range from 0 to 9? Here's how we can modify our random number to get something in the range from 0 to 9. There's a lot going on here, so let's unpack it. We start with math.random, which produces a number between 0 and 1. And from there, we take the number and we multiply it by 10. Now, multiplying by 10 functionally shifts the decimal point to the right. And so what was in the tenths place becomes the whole number part of the number. And keep in mind that this tenths place could have been anything from 0 to 9, which means this number right here would end up being something between 0 and 9. Now, I like the fact that I have a whole number part, but I really don't like the decimal. So my last step is to cast to an int, which drops the decimal, and my final result is 4. Again, this is just an example. The final result could be anything from 0 to 9. Having a number in the range 0 to 9 is great, but what if I wanted a number in the range 1 to 10? How would I do that? Well, the answer is simple. You just tack a plus 1 onto the end, but of course, we need to see why that works. So let's walk through another example. So again, we start out with math.random, and let's say that that produces a number like 0.922. And then we multiply it by 10, so it shifts the decimal, and we end up with 9.22. Now, we don't really like that decimal, so we drop it by casting to an int. And finally, once we've casted to an int, we add 1 to it, and our result gets us to 10. And so this is how we'll get a number in the range from 1 to 10. Previously, if we didn't have the plus 1, the maximum value we could have gotten would have been 9. Here's a general pattern showing you how to get a random number in any range. Basically, we start with math.random. We multiply by how many possible values we want. For example, if you wanted 10 possible random numbers, you would multiply by 10. If you wanted only 3 possible random numbers, you would multiply by 3. Of course, we typecast that to an int, and at the end, we add the number that we want to start with. So let's see an example. Suppose we wanted a random number in the range of 2 to 5 inclusive. Well, if we think about it, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is 4 potential numbers starting at 2. So we say math.random times 4, and then we do a plus 2 at the end. Let's do a quick understanding check. I'd like you to write down the code to generate a random number in the range 1 to 100 and then 6 to 10. Pause the video, write it down, let's see if this is making sense, and when you're ready, unpause and we'll go over the answer. Following our pattern for 1 to 100, we say math.random times 100 because we want 100 possible values, and then we say plus 1 because we want to start at 1. For 6 through 10, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is 5 possible values, and we want to start at 6. So we say plus 6 at the end. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to use common methods in the math class, including absolute value, power, and square root, and also be able to use math.random to make a random number in any range.